Dobroveche, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a podcast about history. My name is Will, and joining me in the lovely carpet shop basement is my good friend Nick.
Привет, comrades. Although actually that's probably the most inappropriate saying for the topic we're about to talk today. But before we get to that, how have you been, Will?
Well, obviously, I've been reading about history in preparation.
Don't lie. Don't lie to the good people.
No, I've been doing some DIY. I've been making history. On a very minor scale.
I'm looking forward to spending the next hour talking to someone who has no idea what they're talking about, which is going to be fun.
Yes, good. Have you considered getting a cat?
Well, I've got you, so
right.
You leave less hair, I imagine.
I know. Is that why you've built a cat flap in?
Have you not been using that? Oh.
Well, I did wonder.
Oh, okay.
It also explains why you put that chip in my neck.
And why I keep leaving bowls of food out for you.
Well, that is appreciated. But yes, today we've got a new topic to talk about. So
as opposed to an old one, we just thought we'd just go back and redo.
Well, I don't know. We're, what were we? 13, 14 episodes in. People are going to start forgetting. We could do the NHS again, couldn't we? They'd never know. So Nick, why don't you explain what we're going to be talking about today?
So yes, anyway, we're taking a look at a specific period in Russian history today. And of course, there are many, many tragic periods and figures in Russian history. In fact, tragedy is pretty much a common thread that runs through fiction and reality in Russia. We've all read a good, heartwarming Russian novel, haven't we, where someone survived in some form.
Babushka Goes to the Shops.
Yes, I believe that's a very popular children's book in your imagination. Today we'll be focusing on arguably the last great reformer of Russia, Alexander II. Now, of course, as with any historical figure, there is a lot to get through. So we'll be mainly focusing on who he was as a person and some of the efforts he made to ensure Russian Tsardom would survive. But I will just briefly mention, he is actually the Tsar that sold Alaska to the United States. And he got quite a bit of cash for it at the time, I suppose. Especially considering it was under threat of invasion. So he's kind of, like how a football team sells a player they know is going to leave. So you just get rid of it there and then before someone poaches it, really. But yes, we're focusing on Alexander II, who's actually often been compared to Lincoln.
Oh, yeah, I guess I could see that, yeah.
Because he emancipated the serfs. Now, I feel like we should point out what a serf is.
Yes, so serf, we're not talking about that thing you do on a board on the beach. We're talking about something much more depressing.
Board on the beach. That's, yeah.
Though, if I was going to open a surf shop, I'd probably call it serfdom. How
is your stand-up routine coming along for Russian-based comedy?
Well, it's very hard when it's just the two of us in a basement. I don't have much of an audience to gauge. So I think it's probably worth going into a bit about who the serfs were. So while calling Alexander the Russian Lincoln might seem like quite a big deal, maybe we should really be calling Lincoln the American Alexander II, as while Lincoln did free the slaves, he did so a full 2 years after Alexander ended serfdom in Russia. While a slave and a serf are technically two different things, a slave is a word which sort of has more of an emotional context to it, I think. But there's actually a lot of similarities between slaves and serfs as they existed in Russia at the time. The Russian serfdom system actually dated back to 1649 and the introduction of a legal code which had granted total authority to the landowner to control the life and work of the peasant serfs who lived on their land. Since this included the power to deny the serf the right to move elsewhere, and also the power to decide who they could and could not marry, or how many kids they could have, it was essentially like being owned by a member of the nobility.
A slave, you could sell them and move them on as you pleased. Serfdom was a little different. It meant you were tied specifically to the land that you worked. So if a new owner moved in, he would acquire not just the land, but all the serfs that worked the land. And, they were essentially shackled to the soil.
It's sort of the difference between owning a car, which you could sell on to somebody else, and owning a garden shed, which sort of stays in the garden when you sell the house.
It depends how well you build the shed. But yeah, there's a good analogy.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, we're sort of mentioning the comparison between serfs and slaves. Slavery had actually already been ended in Russia by Peter I in 1723, though obviously serfdom managed to persist.
Yeah, they traded one evil for another.
As we'll come to see, Russian history is full of this sort of thing. There's a lot of progression followed by kind of receding back into more traditional values.
Yes, and in many ways, Alexander II is a microcosm of that tragic history because he sort of bounced between reform and repression in his lifestyle. And so when Alexander becomes Tsar in 1855, he inherits a Russia that, we're going to go into this in a minute, but he inherits a Russia with so many problems. And one of the chief problems that everyone could see was serfdom. It was holding Russia back. By this time, all of Europe had basically outlawed slavery, even if America hadn't. And they were all progressing towards a more sort of capitalistic society. And Russia was lagging behind immensely. It was like a wheezing old man of Europe. It needed a lot of change and innovation. And Alexander was the total opposite to his father, Nicholas. He recognized the need for change, even if it came from the same sort of feeling that his dad had, that he wanted to cling on to power. He understood that things have to change or change is forced upon you.
So Alexander, when he was growing up, he always respected his father and he respected the rule of the Tsar. But once he came to power, Alexander decided that he was going to do things his own way. He was now the autocratic ruler. He did have his work cut out for him, though. Russia wasn't in a great way. And actually the reputation of the Romanov dynasty, who Alexander and his father were members of, had been tarnished by Nicholas I. And they were sort of generally unliked by a lot of the other European royal families at the time.
Yeah, that was mainly because of the Crimea, which is a massive war. It's kind of like the war of its generation.
Crimea is relevant, but it's also a very big topic. And it's one of those wars where you can kind of point at where it started, but there's quite a bit of lead up.
But we'll come back to that. We'll start with basically who Alexander was, because this podcast is focused on him and his achievements.
Yeah, we don't care about Nicholas. Get out of here, Nicholas.
Yeah, I mean, who likes anyone called Nicholas anyway? Nicholas. Horrible name.
When are we doing the one on William the Conqueror, by the way?
Oh yeah, what a fine fella he was. Alexander was one of a long line of Romanovs, or Russian Tsars, that can be traced all the way back to 1613, when they sort of supplanted the previous house, which was a sort of Viking house led by a king called Rurik. He was born on the 17th of April, 1818, and his father ascended the throne by substitution, because Nicholas wasn't technically the legal heir to the throne. His brother Constantine was, but Constantine privately declined to take the throne. He just didn't want it. This led to lots of confusion and ended up leading to a bloody insurrection, which was termed the Decembrist Revolt, because obviously it took place in December, where a bunch of troops tried to storm the palace and, put Constantine on the throne, but Nicholas's troops won the day. And, it's a lot of people were killed.
Yeah, so Nicholas was your typical old-school Russian ruler. He was very dominating, he was very authoritarian. Alexander's mother, however, who was Charlotte of Prussia before she married Nicholas, was kind of different. She was a bit more... She's a bit nicer. She's a bit nicer. And she... She entrusted the development of Alexander to the poet Vasily Zhukovsky, who was a humanitarian liberal and a romantic. And
something Nicholas I did not like at all.
No, he was not keen on that. No. But his mother got her way. And Zhukovsky had quite a large influence on Alexander as he was growing up. And it's some of these values that we see in his rule.
Yes, funny enough, the marriage, although you would imagine it would be like chalk and cheese, the marriage between Nicholas I and Charlotte was a really happy one. Like, they were actually properly loved each other by all accounts. So he came from, usually royal marriages, they're kind of cold, sterile affairs, like, I have to marry this person because my parents say I have to. But, they generally loved each other, and they actually lived in a small cottage next to the Winter Palace. And yes, Alexander was tutored by Vasily. To the point where his father sort of was greatly displeased by this. He thought his son was becoming too feminine and too tender. and was a bit too flamboyant, actually. And this greatly displeased him, so in order to toughen him up, he would give him classmates to sort of push him around a bit. He would send him on military parades and stuff, but he actually really enjoyed the parades. He enjoyed the pageantry of marching out and trotting on a horse, and I'm not sure if Nicholas I enjoyed that either, but...
who wouldn't love it? Trotting around on a horse in a parade.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it wasn't just Nicholas II who thought this. Alexander struck the entire court as someone who was a bit too kind, too pure, to sort of have the harshness of what a ruler needed.
Yeah, he was sort of considered kind of lazy, not that bright, and a bit of a romantic. So nobody really had that high expectations for him as Tsar, and nobody would have expected really for him to grow up to be the great reformer that he became.
Yeah, what made me laugh in my research, there's a great book, by the way, I recommend everyone read it, by Edvard Tasinski, who we mentioned earlier, where he sort of looks into Alexander's childhood. And in order to toughen him up during his childhood, they made him keep a diary of transgressions. So any time he was lazy, weak, or generally had bad behaviour, which bad behaviour included crying, he had to write it down. Now, from this diary, we learned he cried a lot. He cried at everything. He was truly a romantic of the 18th century, because back in the 18th century, in Romanticism, men were encouraged to cry and let their emotions out, you know. So we've kind of come full circle with today's society where men are encouraged to be vulnerable.
It is very easy to assume that in the past that, you know, men were sort of macho and manly and all of this, and that this whole sort of phenomenon of men showing their emotions is a more recent thing. But we can actually see throughout history there are periods where it just becomes quite fashionable for men to dress nicely, to show their emotions. Basically, look at things like Byron or Beau Brummel, that sort of, around the sort of the Georgian period, it just sort of became fashionable to not be a big smelly macho man.
Yeah, as my dad would say, a bunch of weeping Nancys.
Exactly. Well, obviously, as big smelly macho men ourselves, we don't.
Oh yes,
we don't understand any of this.
Of course, by smelly you mean of roses, right?
Of Chanel number 5.
But anyway, so yeah, he put Alexander in lots of military positions, and as he grew up, he put them in charge of like the guards and the grenadiers and things like that. And he even at one point, which I found quite interesting, he was put in charge of mock executions, including one of basically mock executions was designed to terrify the crap out of people. And at the very last minute, they would be lined up in front of a firing squad. At the very last minute, someone would run in and go, oh, "They've been pardoned by the grace of the Tsar," as like it was a big power play, basically. And one of these was actually the famous author Dostoevsky, who originally started life as a soldier and started writing and ended up falling into sort of, literary groups who had a bit of a revolutionary zeal. They just had a bit too much time, and they had this romantic ideal of revolution and disrupting the Tsardom. So yeah, he was put on a mock trial, which was overseen by Alexander II. But in an interesting twist, when we come to the end of Alexander's life, he was assassinated. So spoilers, sorry. But we won't tell you how.
Well, you can switch off now then.
The assassins operated out of a small apartment building in Moscow, which happened to be absolutely next door to where Dostoevsky lived. It's one of those weird historical coincidences, although there is some suggestion that he may have slightly been involved, but we never know. But yes, anyway, in 1841, Alex married love of his life, which was Princess Maria of Hessen-Rhine. So, another German.
Those Germans, they were all over those royal families in the 19th century. They just popped up everywhere.
I know, it's amazing how they didn't end up marrying family members. Oh, wait, never mind. Anyway, and she converted to Orthodox Christianity, which is obviously the religion of Russia. Although he was a sensitive, caring, kind individual, he was a randy one. So he had quite a succession of like affairs and mistresses, but the chief one was actually very strange, because after Maria's death, he ended up marrying his mistress, Princess Catherine de Korokova, with whom he already...
Did you just call her Korokova?
No, Dolkurokova.
So he married tennis player Maria Kornikova.
Yes, let's go with that. With whom he already had 4 children. So he actually married her, I think it was less than a month after his previous wife died. And she was already living in the palace next to Maria. And it was weirdly harmonious, but very strange to all the nobles around.
It wasn't just politically that he was slightly liberal-minded.
Just an excuse, isn't it? Oh yes, I'm liberal-minded, so I've got 3 wives.
Well, it never hurts to have a spare.
It's actually quite funny because when he was touring around Europe, apparently he met a young Queen Victoria and was quite taken with her. And he had a bit of a crush on her, but the match was never approved of by the British royalty, much to his annoyance.
Yes, it was considered a bit problematic for two rulers to marry. You end up with sort of William and Mary issue.
Oh, yeah. But, being Victoria, she had her eyes on a German because they were all married.
Yes.
Married Germans rather than a Russian.
But imagine how different British history would have been if she'd have married Alexander instead of Albert.
So we'd have the Victoria and Alexander Museum.
We would, yes. And it would be guarded with armed guards. And the serfs wouldn't be allowed in.
Yeah, we'd still be serfs, yeah.
No Christmas trees. That was an Albert thing.
One stocking full of coal every year over the fireplace.
There would be the concrete pillar of Christmas. And we would all have to pay for it.
Well, no, you're applying Soviet aesthetic to the Tsardom, who are quite garish and quite, ostentatious.
It's hard, though, isn't it, sometimes? Because we grew up in sort of the shadow of the Cold War. It kind of... I mean, we were born right into the end of it, and then all the after effects, everything was sort of... Coming from that, it's very easy to associate Russia with Soviet Russia. But obviously Russia existed for a long, long time before the Bolsheviks turned up.
Yeah, I mean, the communist rule of Russia didn't even last a century.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long.
It was a blip in Russian history.
But anyway, Alexander ascended the Tsardom in 1855, right in the middle of the Crimean War, when basically everything was going to pot. And he was only 36 years old, and his father basically admitted on his deathbed, like, I'm sorry, mate, this is all going to shit, you're going to have to deal with this. And he died of pneumonia, funnily enough, Nicholas I. He didn't die of anything heroic or tragic. He just died of pneumonia, which is kind of a limp way to go, really.
It is, considering the kind of ruler he was. It was a sad way to go, really.
So on top of an incredibly disastrous, messy war, he had an ill-equipped army. The entire country lacked any form of massive infrastructure like roads, railways, things like that. There was a massive, bloated and corrupt bureaucracy that was the only thing that did function across the land, which was so well accepted that it was kind of custom to plan in corruption to dealing with officials.
It's kind of coming back around again. Part of the reason why the army was so ineffective is because it was mainly made up of conscripted serfs.
Oh yeah, that was right. There were two ways. The army consisted of two types of people. It was conscripted serfs who had to serve 25 years.
Yeah, and given
to earn freedom.
Given the lifespan of your typical serf at the time, that's essentially a life service.
Yeah, 20. Yeah, or you were a convict who was basically said, right, you can go to prison or you can go and serve in the army.
Yeah, and when you consider that the serfs were basically treated a bit like cattle, I mean, they weren't educated, they weren't particularly well trained. I imagine morale was pretty low. You can see why they weren't a particularly effective force.
Yeah, I mean, we won't go into the Crimean War because that's a fascinating topic in itself. But essentially, it all began over a sort of dispute about the operation of shrines in the Holy Land, and cascaded and escalated to Nicholas I posturing and believing in his title, because he was labelled the gendarme of Europe, because he's really the last truly autocratic ruler.
Yeah, he was actually... It was here that he famously referred to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, which is sort of one of those sayings that just, even today, just keeps getting repurposed. I think they're using it on Britain at the moment.
Yes, with the very sick, wheezing man of Europe, despite our vaccination efforts.
And considering what happened to the Ottomans, that probably doesn't bode so well for us.
But he was partially right, because basically he annihilated all the Turkish troops. It gave them a sort of false confidence when Britain and France turned up, and then absolutely annihilated them back.
So, so Alexander II, he becomes the Tsar right in the middle of this war, which was probably a bit ill-advised, isn't going so well for Russia. Plus, he's got all these other issues going on at the moment that we've gone over. So he's got quite a big job on his hands.
He's got a bloody big job on his hands. Just to put this in context in terms of infrastructure, for example, at his ascension to the throne, there were fewer than 600 miles or 965 kilometres of railway across a country that was mammoth in size. And when he died, he had succeeded in building around 14,000 miles of railways.
But that's just one of his sort of achievements during his life, was the huge expansion of the railway lines. And you can see later how that sort of ties into his abolishment of serfdom. and Russia kind of getting a bit of a kick up the arse, and suddenly they were able to sort of industrialise more than they could have before.
Well, this is where the abolishment of serfdom comes in, because obviously it's a very feudalist system. And in order to become a more capitalistic society, which is what he wanted Russia to be, he wanted them to be wealthy and profitable and happy. They needed to get rid of these shackles.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I mean, if you were very cynical, you could argue that, yes, Europe had outlawed slavery, but they'd become, overworked, exploited, living on nothing in the rest of places like England and Germany.
Having a whole load of your population being basically a load of untrained, uneducated peasants who are, compelled to work the land. Sounds like a great idea, but what you end up with is just a whole load of uneducated, untrained peasants.
Farmers, basically.
And that's not very good for, progression.
So when he took charge, he instituted the most sweeping set of reforms that Russia had ever seen since Peter the Great. And at his coronation, he even granted amnesty to some of the Decembrist rebels who had so infuriated his father. So Nicholas I would probably be rolling in his grave.
He couldn't help sticking it to his dad.
Yeah. He did a lot of things which helped Russia flourish in an academic sense. He lifted a lot of censorship restrictions, because Nicholas I was very, certain people weren't allowed to go to school, they weren't allowed to read books, you couldn't write certain things. Foreign travel was again permitted, so people could go outside the borders and learn about other people and learn about life. And police spies were reduced. And this all happened in the first couple of years between 1855 and 1857. Of course, his most memorable reform was the emancipation of the serfs. And this was something he set about working to try and achieve from the very beginning, because it wasn't just something he could go, right, lads, you're all free. Because you have a whole bunch of nobles whose entire life depends on these serfs working for them. So he had to convince a whole section of society to go along with his plan to make Russia better.
Yeah. I mean, what helped his argument was that while he was rightfully known as the Tsar Liberator, and we look back and we think he was doing the right thing, it was a humanitarian thing, there was actually a pragmatic reason for it. Basically, the Tsar relied on the nobles, but the nobles who owned the serfs were all in loads of debt. And the serfs were growing in population, but the living conditions were pretty bad. They weren't very well looked after. And this affected their productivity, which meant they didn't work the land as effectively as they could, which meant the nobles weren't getting as much money, which was this circle of debt. It
wasn't just a circle of debt, it was a circle of death. As we mentioned, corruption was everyday and commonplace, but so were peasant uprisings. Between 1826 and 1854, the Ministry of the Interior had a record of the known number of peasant uprisings. So there was probably hundreds more. It was 712. Just, the significant amount of uprising.
If you're basically tied to the land, you have no choices in life. You're treated terribly, and there's no way of getting out of it. Suddenly, something like revolution looks like quite a good idea, even though you know that the ramifications are going to be quite bad.
Despite obviously being viewed as a bit dim by his peers, he was actually quite clever about it, because upon easing the intellectual restrictions that had plagued Russian academia under Nicholas I, this openly allowed serfdom to become part of everyday conversation, and people to look around and go, actually, this doesn't make much economic sense. This doesn't make much practical social sense. And so it was actually quite a clever move on his part to get that conversation moving and going. And they sort of trialled pilot schemes in different places. I think there was one province in formerly a part of Lithuania who proposed to free their serfs, but not give up their land. But Alexander wanted to take this a step further, because there's no point in freeing a bunch of serfs if they've got nothing to survive or live on.
Yeah, all you've got then is just millions and millions of homeless people.
Exactly. But the problem was he didn't have any money to purchase the land off the nobles. So over the next 5 years from his ascension, you had thousands of officials sitting in a range of different committees figuring out plans for the abolition of serfdom. Unfortunately, all these officials were from the nobility who happened to have stakes in this, who happened to own land and own serfs. So they presented their proposals to Alexander, who formally issued an imperial proclamation freeing the serfs in 1861. And it contained 22 separate measures whose details filled about 360 pages of a large volume, all with rules and regulations about freeing serfs, what you could do, how much you could give them in terms of remuneration. But it wasn't an instant process. It would take time. And it was the landlords who would end up the main beneficiaries. So all these regulations were mainly around compensating them.
Yeah, so while it was a huge upheaval in the way that Russian society worked, and it was a step forward for the serfs, it didn't go quite as far as maybe it could have done. One of the clauses said that the serfs were required to make 49 annual redemption payments for the land they were given. Considering that the average lifespan of a serf hadn't really increased, this was kind of a lifelong debt. And it was also a debt that could be inherited by their children. So it crossed generations. And for that time, until they made their payment, they were still effectively tied to that land.
No, exactly. Well, a lot of serfs did eventually do that. But how it was done was that individual serfs didn't really buy land. They got into communes, and the communes were then sold the land. And so, yes, as you said, they were saddled with these payments. That's essentially reshackled them to the land. I mean, imagine you've been working a land and your family's been working land for, say, hundreds of years, and the Tsar says, "You're free now. You can live and work as you please." And then someone comes along and says, "Right, this strip of land that your family's been living on for like 200 years, yeah, you're going to give me a large chunk of cash for this, right? And you're going to have to pay it over the next, like, 5 generations." They're going to be a bit annoyed.
Yes. The landowners were also allowed to retain personal land, though the definition of personal land was kind of eventually, it was a bit loose, and they could basically grab whatever they wanted. This, however, led to rebellions in the countryside, which ultimately led to deaths. The peasants didn't blame the Tsar, though, luckily for him, but instead they blamed the bureaucrats and the landowners in charge. At the time, over a third of the population, some estimates go as high as 45%, were considered serfs, which is quite a lot of people to have annoyed at you.
Very dangerous number to have annoyed at you. But yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the most interesting things about Alexander, was that he was just not very well liked by all the nobles, but all the common folk really looked up and revered him. They saw him as their savior. But he overall was actually quite happy with what he achieved in terms of serfdom. He thought he had dealt a massive wave of change to Russia, which he had, and he turned his attention to reforming the other areas which made life difficult for people, such as local government, which was incredibly corrupt. Basically, central government controlled everything. They micromanaged everything, and he wanted to alleviate this. First, as a way of freeing up power, being in too many corrupt hands, and secondly, as a way of giving regions more autonomy, to sort of quell any uprisings locally, so you wouldn't have to keep sending in the Cossacks and the troops to sort of put them down.
So one of these reforms was, say, in 1864, Alexander introduced local government institutions. These were known as the zemstvas. These zemstvas provided local representation and a forum for debate for the people living there. It was sort of like what we know today, in Britain at least, as your sort of county council, or your town council maybe.
Good God.
Can you imagine?
Your shrubbery's a bit too tall.
Luckily for people concerned about their shrubberies, they ended up not really being as effective as they were expected to be. They ended up being dominated by nobles, and they didn't really have the power to control taxation or law and order. They were, however, elected through a voting system, though the voting system wasn't particularly fair.
Some of these reforms actually brought about a lot of positive change in certain areas, and in other areas they didn't really make a dent. Because Russia was such a large, wild, untamed place, it was so easy to sort of create your own little kingdom.
I think being an ex-serf must have been a bit like being a Labour supporter in a town full of elderly people. You're like, okay, I get a voice, but...
I mean, you're doing a great disservice to elderly people. The zemstvas were the closest thing to democracy in Russia. I mean, you could argue some of the reforms instituted by Nicholas II with the Duma, which was kind of like the parliament, were close, but they were also sort of slightly unfair and rigged. One of the good things about it was it gave the people who were in charge the right to hire professionals who could provide good services. So you had doctors, teachers, vets. So people did, in some places, people managed to get a better way of life than they previously did. But it was very hit and miss. And the same follows from the next set of reforms, which is all about the judicial service. So in November of the same year, in 1864, he kind of instituted one based on the French system, which helped remove corrupt practices, such as landowners being judges and making rulings on their land, providing the right of appeal to people, and everyone was considered equal before the law. So it doesn't matter if you were of noble birth or you were born in a ditch, you had the same rights.
Yeah, it also opened proceedings to the press so that they could now be reported on freely. it's sort of interesting to look back and think that we've gone from serfdom to what is. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff here which we would expect in a modern society.
Yeah.
But we've gone from that in the matter of a few years. It's a massive upheaval of Russian society at the time. Actually, going back to the judicial reforms, interestingly, they didn't apply in Poland.
Yes, well, Poland was Poland was a special case because they had a kind of mini uprising where Poland was actually a testing ground for some of these reforms, and it ended up with the Polish people going, we're going to take our country back, which led to a slightly repressive response from Alexander, who said, "What the hell are you doing?" and then took away all their rights.
Yes, I think that was going to be quite common for Poland over the next 150 years.
And the preceding centuries as well.
Yeah, historically, Poland has had a rough time.
It's had a very rough time, yeah. But going back to his reforms, glossing over the repressive nature of the Polish uprising, 1864 also saw schools open to all social rungs, and primary schools were actually developed into a thing, and universities were given a certain degree of intellectual autonomy. And in fact, it's quite sad because what happens next derails all of this reform. So Education Minister Alexander Golovin was about to embark on an even more ambitious reform package for universities when the first in many attempts on Alexander II's life begin to occur. And that happens in April 14th, 1866.
So the first attempt on Alexander's life was by Dmitry Karakazov, who was a nobleman and a member of a communist student group. He was considered a bit unbalanced, and he tried to kill the Tsar, fearing his reforms would de-radicalise the student population.
Funny enough, this is a common theme across the nobles as they proceed to then attempt Alexander, because they saw it as putting a band-aid on an amputated leg. They wanted full-scale revolution.
So his attempt to shoot the emperor was foiled by a peasant who was luckily well rewarded. Who was the peasant?
I was trying to find who the peasant was, and no one tells me who the peasant was.
Unfortunately, the judicial reforms didn't work in Karakazov's favour, as he was tried and hanged for the crime.
Oh, no, to be fair, he did go through the process, but he was incredibly guilty, so what do you do with that? Corporal punishment was, of course, still very much a thing across the world in this era. So
he was hanged, but it
was a fair trial.
We made sure he was guilty first. Yeah. So,
but what this is interesting is this really sparks the birth of sort of terrorism, but terrorism from the intellectuals across Russia, and it was terribly frightening to Alexander that, for centuries the Romanovs have been killing each other. Like, a lot of emperors were assassinated by their own family members. This was the first time that it occurred to them that their own people could come and assassinate them, and it forced him into a rapid change on his reforms.
In hindsight, we can look at his reforms, and I think generally we look at them as being quite positive. At the time, this was quite new territory, and he was probably on quite thin ice. And it was such a big shift from the old way of doing things to the new that there was going to be some pushback. And I think that's where these assassination attempts come in.
Exactly, and it's easy to think of Alexander as this kind, great, wise man, but everything he did was entirely to preserve his own position. But anyway, so after this, he basically scraps all the different reforms, goes back to sort of limiting university chatter. The only area that does end up getting a bit more reform is the army, which desperately needed it.
So as we previously mentioned, the army that Alexander inherited was not in a particularly good way. Corruption was all over the place. The soldiers themselves were badly trained. Morale was low. Alexander's reforms did go some way of alleviating this. They removed the 25-year conscription and they opened it up to the whole population with a few exceptions. And conscription was reduced from 25 years to 6 years, which was an improvement.
I'd say it's a bit more reasonable.
Yeah, that's a bit better. However, corruption and lack of investment and lack of training was still a bit of an issue.
It was, but they did, as we've mentioned, when he did try and institute reform, it would have a greater impact in some areas and lesser impact in others. And the majority of soldiers' lives did improve. They were given better room and board. They were even given education. They were taught to read and write, because obviously it's no good having a soldier out in the field who doesn't know his arse from his elbow, or his rifle butt from his rifle barrel. That's even more dangerous. So they did improve the quality of the recruits to a large degree, which would then serve him quite well during another war that would arise in the East.
It's always another war, isn't it? It's
always
the
another
19th
war.
century Europe. He also ended corporal punishment within the military. He made attempts to improve the professionalism of the officer corps, which was quite nice. Also, probably most importantly, he made the uniforms more comfortable.
I mean, that's what you really want when you're stationed in a Russian winter, so
Yes.
screw the rifles, I want comfy socks.
He also extended the reserve forces, and he created a military district system, which split the Russian state into 15 military districts, which would actually survive and still be in use over 100 years later.
All the while that Alexander was reforming the army, the intelligentsia, the Russian nobles who were a bit educated and sort of yearned for a bit of revolution because they were bored with their way of life and bored with how Russia was run. They saw serfdom as a kind of a bit of a failure, even though they were the ones who helped design it. So it's really their own making. They refused to sort of accept their mistakes, instead blamed Alexander and the Tsardom. And they had a kind of romantic view of the way serfs lived. They had this misconception that peasants yearned for democracy. They didn't care. They just wanted to be fed and have a happy life. That's what they wanted. And so one of the peasant societies was actually called the Narodniks, who basically formed together and went out into the countryside to try and foment revolutionary ideals amongst the peasants. They really badly misjudged how loyal the peasants were to the Tsar. They loved Alexander. They hated the noble people. They hated these people they saw that had ruined their lives. So when they came down to try and say, you should rebel against your Tsar, they just handed them to the secret police. They just handed them in. It was a colossal failure. So after they had failed to make an impact on the peasants themselves, they decided, we're going to take matters into our own hands. And taking the example of the earlier assassination, they turned to violence. And so from about 1878, they just went around different city centres, different villages, assassinating basically anyone that had a sort of high official ranking. And then they realised, maybe we shouldn't be going for the small fry, maybe we should be going for the big dog.
This is essentially what we would call today terrorism.
Yes, it is terrorism. It's exactly that. It's terrorism. I mean, what else would you call it?
I don't know. You don't really hear, the word terrorism used much historically. It feels like, something that kind of a more modern thing, but I don't know.
So yeah, by 1879, you had like over a dozen police chiefs and governors murdered. And then in 1879, on April the 2nd, the second attempt on Alexander's life, but the first in this series of attempts, was made. So a man called Alexander Soloviev, who was part of the Land and Freedom Organization, who were originally the Narodniks, who had failed miserably out in the countryside, took 5 shots at the Tsar and all missed, and he ended up imprisoned for it.
Oh. They're obviously not very good terrorists.
No, they weren't very good at all.
Out of interest, what was their plan once they'd assassinated Alexander II? Were they hoping that Alexander III would be more open to their ideals?
They imagined it would spark an uprising. They thought it would be the catalyst for the downfall of the entire Tsardom,
Right.
and that people would rise up and take control.
So in November, a group called Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will, set off a large explosion after tunnelling under the track along the Moscow railway.
Yes, they had planned to obviously blow up the track with Alexander on a train, but he didn't travel the route. He changed routes at the last minute, basically. So they missed him. Then in February 1880, there was a man named Kolturin who managed to place himself within the Winter Palace as a sort of like worker there. And he smuggled dynamite in over some months and set them under the dinner table. Unfortunately, he set them off at the wrong time because the blast killed 11 and wounded 55 who were attending a state dinner. But the Tsar was unscathed because he was held up in another room talking to someone else who just wouldn't let him leave. He was incredibly lucky in some ways because he dodged all these attempts because his secret police was so inept. So in the end, he kind of turned back to maybe saying, well, actually, maybe I should go back to reform.
You can kind of see, obviously he was quite lucky to avoid some of these attempts, why his attitude would change.
Some assassins got cross wires. Some just simply overslept, so they missed the chance to assassinate him. Aside from the bombing attempt in the palace, there were other failed bombing attempts. One assassin even found himself standing next to the Tsar, but because he was standing with him in a public place, he felt like too much of a gentleman to kill him.
Could you imagine though? You do these sweeping reforms to lift up the quality of life of millions of people, and someone keeps trying to kill you for it.
But basically, so in order to combat this, he appointed General Count Michael Loris Milakov to head a commission that would simultaneously explore reforms and brutally suppress terrorism. So, a
little step backwards then.
So a step forward and a step backwards, so not really moving at all. And address it, because he thought reforms would address the root causes. There's no sense in sort of locking up a bunch of terrorists if you're always going to be generating new ones. So he wanted to address, he was smart enough to realise you can't just club something, you've got to, use a bit of carrot as well.
It's a bit like whack-a-mole. Another one will pop up.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder where you were going with that, but that's quite a good analogy. And the commission resulted in the suggestion of an elected body representing all classes to serve and consult the Tsar in matters of policy, effectively a constitutional monarchy.
So that brings us to the 13th of March 1881, which was the very day that Alexander had signed the documents implementing these recommendations we've been talking about. This also happened to be the day that the assassins finally got him. While they didn't actually know at the time that he was signing the documents on that day, it wasn't actually something that they wanted anyway, as they feared that a small voice for the population would stifle further radical progress.
And so he was actually on his way back to the Winter Palace. He just visited one of his noblemen, his relatives, and his carriage was returning to the Winter Palace accompanied by a bunch of Cossacks and officials. And on the way home, he was actually made late to return because of this meeting. And he had a bunch of different routes protected by secret police, including the main route. And it's probably a good thing that he didn't take this route, because this route, despite being protected, had been mined underneath by the terrorists. But they'd also prepared backup bombers for potential other routes that he might take. And unfortunately for Alexander, he took the canal route, or rather his driver took a shortcut along the canal. It's said that before he left, he promised his wife he wouldn't take the main road, he'd take a shortcut around the canal anyway. But they were well prepared, the People's Will. They had lined the streets with lots of people carrying bombs.
So unfortunately, Alexander's luck finally ran out, as a man called Nikolai Rysakov, the son of a sawmill worker, stepped out and threw a bomb consisting of a mixture of nitroglycerin and pyroxylin at the coach. Amazingly, Alexander was unharmed, thanks to a bulletproof carriage which had been gifted to him by Napoleon III. However, the two Cossacks who were with him were less lucky, as well as a small boy.
Yes, unfortunately. Alexander was typically kind of a people's czar. He really was a people's czar. He actually cared about his subjects. So whether it was just because he just had a bomb thrown at him and he maybe had a slight concussion wandering out the carriage, he apparently showed immediate concern for the loss of life that had occurred around him. So you had the chief of police desperately saying, "You need to get out of here, mate. There might be more bombers." And he was going, "Yeah, it's fine. We need to make sure these people are fine." Fortunately, moments later, another assassin, whose name is actually contested because, in fact, it took him a while to find out who he was, mainly because no one would identify him from the terrorist group. Ignacy Hryniewicki, or Ignaty Iakomovich Gudinowicki. He held a bomb directly close to the Tsar, which killed 24 people, himself, and would be the resulting death blow to Alexander. Someone remarked to Alexander just before he held the bomb, "It's the grace of God that, you're still alive." And Ignacy apparently said, "I wouldn't thank God yet." Alexander suffered fatal injuries. Both his legs were utterly crushed and blown to smithereens. His abdomen was blown open. There are differing accounts about his face. Some say his face was a bit mutilated. Some say his face was vaguely, all right, considering he had a bomb hurled at him. But he survived long enough to be taken back to the palace, where he spent a few hours in agony and died not only in front of his wife, but in front of his son, Alexander III, and his wife, who had apparently just come in from skating, so she was still dressed in her ice skating gear, and their son, Nicholas II, dressed in a sailor suit, who would also become, the final Tsar.
It's sort of gruesomely fitting that in the end it was his compassion that killed him.
And worse still, the bombing destroyed, it had the opposite effect. The bombing destroyed what little support the revolutionaries had anywhere in Russia. It plunged society into mourning at every level, even amongst the intelligentsia, because of the violence and the horrific nature of it. And everyone connected with the attack was caught, captured, interrogated, and executed. And ultimately ushered in decades of repression and misery for Russia that would eventually lead to the 1917 revolution.
So it sort of backfired then?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. The death of Alexander II was obviously quite a large blow for the Russian people. They actually built a church on the spot where he was assassinated, which still stands today. It's called the Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood, which is a very Russian name for a church. So this is the part of the podcast where Nick and I discuss something that we found during the course of our research that has piqued our interest. But yes, shall I start this time?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
So mine is actually a bit of an interesting fact. So we mentioned Alexander II's reforms, how they sort of managed to, while they, freed the serfs, they also opened up society to some extent. There were more freedoms. And this goes for intellectual freedom as well. And from this, Alexander's reign became the age of the great Russian novel. So many well-known Russian novels were actually written around this time during the reign of Alexander II. So these include Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, Tolstoy's War and Peace, and Anna Karenina. I always struggle to say that word. And Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and the book about some brothers. Even if you're not too clued up on your Russian literature, I'm sure many of you have heard of at least one of those books.
One of the things I found was quite interesting. So during the course of the podcast, we have been reading out dates, but we've been doing them according to the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use. In Russia, they didn't actually start using this until 1918. So they still used the old Julian-style calendar, which had been used for hundreds of years, which meant that their days were 13 days behind Western Europe. So all the dates we've been given are actually not the dates they actually happened in Russia, because they would have been 13 days. But they are the same days, but they're different dates in Russia. So what we call the October Revolution is actually celebrated in November.
So if you want to go back in time to save Alexander's life, you better make sure you've got your time machine set to the right calendar.
Exactly, yeah. So in the Julian calendar, Alexander dies on March the 1st, but in the calendar we're using, the Gregorian one, he dies on the 13th. But interestingly, on that note, March happens to be not just a deadly month for Alexander, but a deadly month for being a Russian ruler. So Ivan the Terrible died in March. Emperor Paul I died in March on the 11th.
Something funny about Emperor Paul. Emperor Paul.
You alright, Paul? You alright? You emperor today? Nicholas II had to abdicate during March. Joseph Stalin was found dead in March. And of course, as we said, Alexander died in March. He still dies in March, whether you use the Julian or the Gregorian calendar, so it all fits. So yeah, if you're all in Russia, and I guess Putin every March looks at his watch. Ooh.
This could be it. Yeah, so March is obviously a bad time to be Russian ruler. Hopefully Vladimir Putin is looking over his shoulder around March time.
What do you mean, hopefully? I didn't know you were a closet Putin supporter, but okay.
I am. I just try to be nice.
All right, okay. All right. Anyway, we've actually got an equally somber topic next. No moustaches, but an equally somber topic next week, which is an important one we want to raise. So hopefully you'll join us for that, because it's a part of British history that's a bit shameful, but there's a lot of parts of British history that are very shameful, but that it is deserving of a spotlight.
Yeah. So that was our podcast. Thank you for listening as ever. I hope you enjoyed it. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Are we on TikTok? I don't know. No, we're not on TikTok. Don't go on TikTok.
See you next time.
There is no such thing as race. None.
Really?
There's just a human race. Scientifically, anthropologically, racism is a construct, a social construct.